Okay, this is the reflections for Chapter 11, Pastoral Peoples on the Global Stage, the Mongol Moment. And let's talk about changing the images of pastoral peoples. Pastoral nomads have often received bad press, if you will, in history books. They're only mentioned in regard to their destruction of established civilizations. The educated sedentary peoples have feared and usually despised nomads. And the pastoral peoples were usually illiterate. So we don't have their perspective. Most of what we have comes from the sedentary peoples, the ones that were educated and literate. And as you guys know, usually winners are the ones that write the history, because usually the losers aren't around to write down the account. And so the agricultural societies eventually won out, and those are the ones that have given us the information that we have now. And historians have made recent efforts to present a more balanced view. So to give these pastoral groups a new history. And they really want to emphasize what pastoralists achieved as well as what they destroyed. And the total wars and genocides of the 20th century have made people less judgmental toward the Mongols. And so historians are, but it's also important to keep in mind that historians are shaped by their times. So really, was the Mongol violence that unique? Okay, let's talk about the first visual source here. This is the Flagellants. Flagellation was but one form of penance. What other forms of self-inflicted punishment for sins are suggested in the image? Well, they're walking around without shoes, right? They've gone barefoot. That could be painful. The thinness of the flagellants also implies doing penance through fasting. But also the wearing of white in medieval Christian tradition was associated with penance. As a simple white attire is meant to strip away the wearer's social status. So what is the significance of the Christ on the cross that precedes the flagellants? Well, through their self-flagellation, participants in this movement sought to identify with Christ, who was himself whipped prior to his crucifixion. And Christ was the figure to whom the flagellants turned to as an intercessor when they sought forgiveness for their sins. And with his suffering on the cross, as depicted in the image, that represents the penance he did for all of mankind, which brought meaning to the personal penance practiced here by the flagellants. Now, here's a question. Does the process seem spontaneous or organized? Do church authorities appear to have instigated or even approved this procession? Well, the evidence definitely points to an organized rather than spontaneous procession, because of the flagellants all wearing the same white clothing with their black hats. They're barefoot, they're led by a banner and a crucifix, and they're also lined up in a clear order. But there is some evidence in the image that the procession was not organized, including the lack of an obvious leader of the procession and the absence of clerics or clergymen. And there's no evidence in the image that the church authorities approved the procession because, like I just said, there's no clerical presence in the image, so there's no way to know if they approved of the procession or not. Okay, let's look at burying the dead, visual source number 2. How does this visual source support or contradict the written documents from chapter 11? Well, this particular visual source supports the written accounts because, as Boccaccio indicates, most of the figures burying the dead in this image show little emotions for those that they're burying. It supports the account of the French observer in that even no priests are depicted here. But it contradicts the written account because there are no signs of idleness or dissolution that the Italian observer recounts. And no signs of debauchery in the graveyard, which was a concern for the Pope. And also the woman in the Shaw in the top center of the image helping to lower a corpse into a grave does convey a sense of loss or grief, contradicting Boccaccio's account. How would you characterize the burial scene in this visual source? Well, the scene is very busy, which might seek to convey a large number of burials taking place at the same time. And the scene is orderly. The figures are burying the dead in individual graves, and it conveys a sense of industry and determination to get done what needs to be done. How does it differ from what an image of a proper Christian burial might contain? How might survivors of the plague have regarded such a burial? Well, there are no priests and really no grieving friends, neighbors, relatives, or anything present at the burials. There's no signs of the status of the dead. So that's really different than what might be a proper Christian burial. And a burial without a priest present would have led concerns for the soul of the departed. The lack of grieving friends, neighbors, relatives, that could be seen as problematic because their failure to turn up for the funeral marked a break with social conventions concerning family, right? And that Christian sense of community. Okay, visual source number 3, a culture of death. I think this visual source does a great job of giving you a visual of how bad the plague was. So how is the status of each of the various living figures from left to right? The Pope, the Emperor, and the Empress. How are they depicted? How is their status? Well, the Pope is carrying the symbol of his office in the form of an ornate bishop's mitre and wears an elaborate clerical garb that denotes his status, especially his long crimson robe and papal tiara. The Emperor carries the symbols of an emperor, right, a battle axe and an orb in his hands, and he's also wearing an imperial crown. His clothing denotes status with an elaborately ornate gold pattern on that inner robe, and the use of ermine on his cape. Now, the Empress is depicted with signs of her status as well, including a gown and headgear made of luxurious fabrics and in that luxurious style, illustrating the height of current fashion. What does the white sheet around each of the death images represent? Right. Each of these death images have the white sheet. Now, what do their expressions suggest about their attitude toward the living? Well, the white sheet represents a burial shroud. Symbolically, it represents the lack of status distinctions after death. And the expressions of the death images reveal a lack of deference. I don't know why I say difference. I don't know why I have that in my head. Deference to the status of those that are living. They could be interpreted as authoritative or commanding as they take control of their charges who in life ruled over society. And you notice that the living figures face outward toward the viewer rather than toward the death figures on either side of them. And why? What do you think that means? Well, the positioning of the figures could depict their desire to stay with the living rather than join the dead. Might also represent their failure to prepare for the next life because of their involvement in worldly affairs. And so you got to think, does the portrayal of death pictured here reflect Christian views of death, or does it challenge them? Well, the portrayal of death reflects Christian ideas by emphasizing that everyone will die, regardless of wealth or status, which disappear at death. And elements of a Christian burial ceremony are present, including the shroud and a coffin. And there's a Christian cleric in a pulpit that's over on the far left, observing the scene. Most likely he is present to interpret the scene in a Christian context. But the portrayal also challenges Christian ideas as well. For example, the death figures that lead the living into the afterlife are not noted in biblical texts. Important elements of a Christian death, including extreme unction and a burial ceremony, that's not depicted here. And while there is a priest present far to the left, his role in securing safe passage into the next life is not emphasized. It looks like he's just observing, because he's placed away from the central action, and instead the death figures seem to be the chief guides. So how is this exchange between the Empress and Death reflected in the painting? Let's look at her and their exchange here. It looks like she's almost pulling away from Death in an effort to avoid his grasp. And the Empress and the figure of Death may be engaged in a dance. It almost looks like they're interacting with each other, which is a common motif in similar images from this period. And we have this one, visual source number 4. In the Face of Catastrophe, questioning or affirming the faith. Why is the death figure smiling? Could be because he enjoys taking human life, or he's inflicting pain and suffering. But how does this skeletal figure differ from the ones in the previous source? Well, this figure is merely a skeleton without any human flesh. You know, possesses a less expressive face. You know, it's smiling. And it's not wearing a burial shroud. It even has a spear, armed with a spear. So how are the priest and the Christ figure depicted? What possible interpretations of their gestures can you imagine? Well, the priest and Christ figure are depicted at the side of the dying man's bed at his time of need. And both can be seen as maybe aiding the man that's dying. And the gesture of the priest may be one of blessing at a time that last rites are administered. Jesus' right hand is raised in the sign of a blessing. And his left hand holds the communion wafer, which has lateral and symbolic representations for Christians. And it represents the final communion the dying man takes when he receives last rites. So it also represents Christ's body and the sacrifice that he made, and this sacrifice secured the pathway to salvation. And I think, okay, there we go. One more. Is this the right? I don't think this one, does this one go here? I don't. Okay, yeah, this is the last one. Sorry about any confusion. Okay, good luck on your Part 3 test.